this loud. Can we hear me? Okay.
There you go.
Oh, great. I'd like to start by just thanking everybody for coming. These are always solemn occasions, but they're also occasions to come together and really lean on each other. And so thank you all for coming. We're here today. Here's my alarm. We're here today to celebrate the life and mourn the passing of Ruth Locke. I know to many of you she was mom, to many of you she was grandma, to many of you she was Ruth. To me she was always Graham. So I'm going to read her obituary here, but from thenceforward I'm going to be referring to her as Graham, not Ruth, because it just feels weird for me to call her that. So Ruth was born April 28th, 1934 in Earlville to Andrew and Bodil Nelson. Before retirement, Ruth worked at Sullivan's Bakery in Mendota for many years. Before that, she was a beautician, worked at a Western factory outlet, did plaster and sewing, and worked at Conco. She's survived by her 3 daughters, Shirley Cox, Donna Trost, and Barbara Ridley, 8 grandchildren, Tim Locke, Andrew Rawson, Ian Rawson, Crystal Rawson, Aaron Grace, Jenna Huff, Brad Trost, and Zach Trost, and 7 great-grandchildren. She was preceded in death by her parents. We have some memories we're going to share today. Before that, I'd just like to read this poem from Crystal. She'd hoped that you would carry on the way you always do. So talk about the good times and the way you showed you cared, the days you spent together, all the happiness you shared. Let memories surround you. A word someone might say will suddenly recapture a time, an hour, a day that brings her back as clearly as though she were still here and fills you with the feelings that say she's always near. For if you keep those moments, you will never be apart, and they will live forever, safely locked within your heart. Thank you for that, Crystal. Have a number of memories here to be shared by the children, some of the grandchildren. This is from Jenna and her kids. She says, I would go stay with Grandma for a weekend. We would watch TV and talk. On Sunday, she would always bring donuts home. She was always good for that. When I got older, I would take the girls up and stay for Sweet Corn Festival. That wore Grandma out since the kids stayed up so late and Grandma had to get up early for the bakery. I convinced Grandma to take a kitten I rescued from a parking lot. Little Bit did not like the car ride. She escaped the box on the way home and peed all over. For the longest time, I would hear Grandma say, that damn cat, it bites. Little Bit did have surgery for bad teeth and turned out to be a sweetheart. So I think I was forgiven eventually. I'm sure you were. She loved that cat. This is from Mom, from Barb. Mom and I went on a road trip to Oregon. I wasn't that old, maybe 12 or 13. Mom drove all the way to her brother Roger's place, and we would stop along the way. We pulled into a rest stop so that she could sleep, and I kept asking when we were going to get going. We talked and laughed about it all the time, wondering how we made it there and back with her having next to no sleep. She was always there for me. She bailed me out of situations a lot. She bailed me out of situations a lot. Whenever I messed up, and no matter when I asked her, she would get me back home, and she never hesitated to send me money to get me back. Once she even paid for a taxi to bring me from Midway Airport in Chicago back to Mendota. Another favorite one is when I brought Sally home to meet the family, and we were at Walmart with Mom, I said, Sally has never been smacked before when she did something wrong. So Mom turned and smacked her on the upper arm and said, now you've been slapped. Anything else I can do for you? Grandma was good for that. We cracked up about it, and to this day still talk about it. Another one is when I was studying for my confirmation for church, and I couldn't remember all the stuff I was trying to memorize. We would be riding in the car, and I would sing along to the songs, and she would say, if my confirmation stuff was a song, I would have no trouble remembering it. And she had a good point. From Donna. My mom was one tough cookie. Yes, she was. She amazed many doctors and nurses. She rallied time and time again, and I'm very grateful to my sister Shirley and my nephew TJ for all of their dedication in taking care of Mom. My mom was a hard worker. She worked hard, always, and it was fitting that she passed on Labor Day. I'm so glad that we got to bond over the past 5 years. In fact, once Shirley even said I was the favorite daughter. We'll argue about that forever. Love you, Mom. Be at peace. And from Shirley. My mom was one of the strongest people I know. She fought for life right to the very end. She never lost hope that she would regain her health and be able to do her puzzles and crochet again. She even held on to her car in hope of driving to work again. Toward the end, she grew weary of the battle, tired of the endless problems and the pain that was always there. I hope she is at peace now and resting easy. She is. Taking comfort in the fact that her grandchildren and their children have inherited her strength and independence. I love you, Mom, and I will miss you always, for sure. I have a lot of memories of my own. Like I said, she was always Graham to me and the other grandkids. I remember when we were very little, maybe even before Crystal was born, and it was just me, Andy, and TJ. We were three little hellions that really didn't want to listen to anybody, but we always listened to Grandma. We knew better than to not. You can love your children and your grandchildren through discipline, and Grandma knew that. As kids, we always called her Grambo. We always listened to Grandma. She would come home from work, and she would come through the back door of the house into the kitchen, and she had a leather strap hanging on the wall there. And she never hit us with it, but she didn't have to, because she would come in and she would just hear us. She would hear how rowdy we were being, and Grandma liked a quiet house. And she would just grab that strap and just snap it. And whatever we were doing, we stopped and we put our butts on something. Of course, that was when I was very young. Growing up, we moved away, and her home was always open. If things were hectic in my home, me or Andy or maybe both of us would go stay at Grandma's house for a weekend, maybe for a week, maybe for a summer. We'd always come down for the Sweet Corn Festival every year, and her home was always open to us. When I was 17, I was homeless, and I had a lot of drug problems, and I didn't really have anyone else to lean on, and I eventually got a hold of TJ through the internet and got the okay from Grandma that I could come stay with her, which is how I ended up coming back to Mendota, and I've been here ever since. That was about 20 years ago. And the life I've built since then with my wife of 13 years and all the friends I've made along the way, I don't know what kind of life I would have had without them, and I don't know what kind of life I would have had if she hadn't opened her home to me through spurts of moving in and moving back out and then moving back in. Because I was young, bad at making decisions, and she was always there, no matter how bad a decision I made. Her door was always open, and as years went on, I was out living with Stephanie, and I knew she was having a hard time. We had a little extra money, but I knew there was no way that I could give her money and get her to take it from me. It would not happen. Even though she needed it, and I knew she needed it, so I gave her a Christmas card, and I just put the money inside the card, and I handed it to her. She reads the outside of the card, and she's happy to get it. She opens the card, she sees the money inside, she just drops it in her lap and rolls her eyes and goes, oh my God. But she knew it was in her hand now, and there was no way she was going to get me to take it back. We had the same stubbornness. So she looked at me, and she knew she was keeping that money, and she said, you know you always have a home here. And I didn't know that, and I've always been grateful for it. One of my favorite memories was I got around to watching baseball with her. I never was a fan of baseball. I always felt like you watch it and nothing happens. She loved baseball. She loved the White Sox. She loved White Sox, Willie Nelson, and slot machines. And so she didn't like to watch the away games because the home game announcers, Hawk and DJ, were the only good announcers. They were the only ones. No one else gets to announce the Sox, so she didn't watch the away games. But we watched all the Sox games together for years. And I probably should have Googled it. I can't remember now. 2005, 2006, but they won the championship. And I got to watch that whole season with Grandma, and that was probably the happiest I remember seeing the Sox win. She might have been happier if the Cubs would have messed up in the final hour. She did not like the Cubs, and she shouldn't. There are a lot of great memories with Grandma, with all of us, and you know, in times like this, it's important that we come together, that we share these memories, that we commemorate her life, and that we remind each other of the joy that we had having her in our lives. I do believe all of our strength, all of our independence, all of our character, we're a very, very independent bunch, and I believe we all have Grandma to thank for it. Whether it was genes or just learning from her, she was a tough and independent woman. And I think anyone could have learned a thing or two by watching her life. I have a short message I'm going to share. Before we get into that, I'd like to take just a moment of silence. We have a song prepared, one of Grandma's favorite Willie Nelson songs. So we're going to hit that. just thank you for the time that we all had with her. And I just pray that you be with us today, God. Speak to us through your word. Give us ears to hear, Lord, and a heart to follow what you have to say in your name. Amen. Going to be reading from Ecclesiastes today. Do I have verses for the screen, maybe? All right. We're going to have verses on the screen. There they are. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. It says this: To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep, a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to get and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to rend and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. In these 8 verses, the author here, Solomon, is really just describing his observations of life. And he says in verse 1 that there is a season, there's a time and a purpose for everything. There's a time and a place for all things under the sun. Even that. And as we read through these verses, it can seem kind of strange where we see he says there's a time to kill, a time to hate, a time for war. It can seem kind of strange to see the Bible saying that there's a time for these things. But bear in mind, Solomon isn't saying that any of these things are inherently good. He's just pointing out that these are a reality. These are the problems that we face. These are the struggles that we go through in the world that we live in. So this was written by Solomon almost 3,000 years ago. And while the world has changed dramatically since then, these struggles, these problems he's summarizing here, the world that we live in and the problems that we face 3,000 years later haven't changed at all. We'll still find a time for all of these things in our life and the world that we live in. In verse 2, he says there is a time to be born and a time to die. This is hardly a profound statement. Everything that has a beginning has an end. And we're born into this world for a limited amount of time, but then the day will come that we must leave this world. We all know this. Again, these are not profound words. There is a time to be born, and there is a time to die. And yet, even though we all know this, death has a way of always catching us off guard. In times of loss, we forget that death is natural, and we forget that death is guaranteed upon birth. He goes on in verse 2 to say there's a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted. Now, this might seem like it doesn't have a lot to do with the first half, where he says there's a time to be born and a time to die, but what he's doing here is he's expressing the purpose in all this. When he says there's a time to plant and a time to pluck, the seed is planted into the ground so that the crop can grow, but this is only done so that the crop can be harvested. And when we gather the fruit of that crop, the fruit of that harvest, the plant dies. Its cycle is done. We're subject to this same cycle. There is a time to be born, and if you are born into this world, there is a time that you're going to leave it. In verse 3, he says, there is a time to kill. And again, this is not saying that killing is good. It's not condoning it. It's not saying we should all go out and find occasion to do it all the time. It's just saying that it's a reality. The Israelites had to kill the Canaanites to inherit the land that God promised them. Moses' journey began when he went into the exile after he killed a man in Egypt. David had to slay Goliath in his journey, and Christ had to be crucified. Killing is a reality in our world, and it's an unfortunate one. But the word here, to kill, necessarily mean to murder another person. In fact, murder is a separate word. When it says to kill, what it actually is saying is there's a time to put to death. That doesn't necessarily mean another living thing. Sometimes we come to a point in our lives, we might have to put our ambitions to death. We might have to put our pride to death to deal with something in our life. We might have to put our bad habits to death to deal with something in our life. For years, Grandma kept a bottle of whiskey in her cabinet. And it was sealed. It had never been opened. It told you how old the bottle was. And I asked her about it one day, and she said she kept that bottle in there to remind her of why she quit drinking. And every time she thought she wanted to drink again, all she had to do was look at that bottle and remember how far she had come since she quit. And she knew it wasn't worth it to open it back up. So she had to put that habit to death. Now, interestingly, she went on to say that she would never quit smoking because she'd already given up drinking and she'd already given up chasing men. So she was going to keep on smoking. The day did come that she did quit smoking, and by the way, when she did quit, when she did make that decision, she quit cold turkey and she never lit another one. And I wish I had that from Grandma. Maybe I do. So there is a time in our lives that we will need to put things to death. He goes on to say in verse 3, right after there is a time to kill, he says there is a time to heal. There can be real pain and real affliction in our lives, but there is also a time to be healed. But the order of this list is intentional. He didn't just write these down in whatever order occurred to him. There's an intentional purpose to the order here. You can't die before you're born, and you can't pluck before you plant. And sometimes you can't heal before you hurt. Sometimes we have to put something to death in our life before healing can really begin. And he goes on to say there's a time to break down and a time to build up. And again, he's illustrating what's really happening. When it says there's a time to kill and a time to heal, he goes on to say there's a time to break down and there's a time to build up. And this contrast of harm and heal, to break and to build. The walls of Jericho needed to fall before the building of Israel could be done. When the new covenant with Christ came, the temple had to be torn down for the new covenant to be built up and the new Christ of church to be built up. Sometimes things need to be torn down in order for us to be built back up. Sometimes we need to go through affliction in order to heal. Sometimes we go through a problem and we're praying for healing and we're asking to get better, and we realize the thing that we needed healed, the thing that we were really struggling with, was not this affliction that we've been having. The problem was not the problem that we thought it was. And God has a way of building us up, but life has a way of breaking us down. Death and loss have a way of breaking us down, but God has purpose in all of it. And oftentimes when we hurt, it's so that we can be healed. When we're hurting, it's so that we can identify something in our life that needs addressed, and we can heal from it. So God has a way of building us back up, no matter how much things can hurt sometimes, but we have to let them. In verse 4, he says, there's a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. The scope of this verse can simply be summarized as to say that there is joy and there is sorrow. And I think for all these things, tears and laughter, grief and celebration, we can find plenty of occasions for all of these things in our life. But today, when we're coming together over the loss of a loved one, this is really an occasion for all of these things, because we are here to mourn a loss. We are here to grieve. We are here to hurt. We are here to feel that pain and experience that loss. But we're also here to celebrate a life. We're also here to commemorate. We share our memories of our loved ones, not to deepen the pain of that loss, but to remind ourselves and to remind others of the good times that we did have with them, of the happiness that they brought to our lives, of the joy that they brought to our lives, of the difference that those people made in our lives. That's what we do this for. And again, it is to celebrate. 86 years is a lot of years. that you forget the joy that that person brought you. In verse 5, he says there's a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. Now again, in this list, these orders are intentional, and Solomon is comparing contrasts here. To hurt and to heal is to break and to build. Birth and death is being compared to planting and plucking of crops. So in all these things, he's comparing contrasts, and yet here he talks about gathering stones, throwing stones away, and then he says there's a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. So what do these two have to do with each other? What's the correlation here? We're going to do this backwards. So let's first talk about the second half, where he says there's a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. Really, this just means coming together. It can mean a literal physical embrace, but it literally just means there's a time to come together and there is a time to be apart in our lives. There are going to be times that we are very close with our loved ones, and there may be times in our life that we are not. There may be times in our life that there is distance between us and our loved ones, or there might be a wedge, or there might be something in between you and your loved one.